Hi, so in this video we're going to look at two different viewpoints of grammar. Okay, we're going to look at prescriptive viewpoint of grammar and descriptive viewpoint of grammar. So these are two different ways of looking at grammar. But before we look at that in more detail, have a look at the information in red. The English taught in textbooks is the internationally recognized standard English. But this is not how all native speakers speak. Okay, so when you learn grammar as a second language learner or as a foreign language learner, you learn kind of the standard international English. But let's be honest, okay, English is a global language, and really we can say there are some standards, but there are so many variations. And I found it interesting that just in this description we can find some variations. So the first one is spelling. There are variations in spelling. Recognized with a Z or a Z is more kind of American spelling, and recognized with an S is British spelling. Okay, so even with spelling you can see there's variation. And there's another example of variation here as well. If we look here at the punctuation, okay, there are varieties of different punctuation. So in the UK, the way that we use quotation marks is we put the quotation marks next to the word that's the quote that's just finished, and we put the comma after the quotation marks. In the US, the quotation mark is inside the comma is inside the quotation mark. So even with punctuation, there are varieties. So you can see here that we have spelling, varieties of spelling, and varieties of punctuation. And it's the same with grammar. There are different varieties of grammar. Okay, but let's look at this first. So prescriptive grammar is prescribed by rules. So the prescriptivist view is that there are grammar rules and that we should follow these rules. So it kind of focuses more on that side of the viewpoint. Okay, descriptive grammar describes how real people use language in everyday life. Okay, so the way that real people speak and communicate and form sentences, descriptive grammar describes it from that viewpoint. So these are two different viewpoints. The viewpoint of kind of official standardized rules and the viewpoint of real people and communicating. But as we've just seen in the previous slide, there are different versions. There are different forms of English, different dialects, different varieties of English. Okay, so let's have a look at some examples now. Here you can see prescriptive verb conjugation on the left. This is the kind of standard English conjugation for to be. We're going to use to be as an example. So when we transform to be with various pronouns, this is probably the way that you were taught, okay? I'm sure it was the way you were taught. So here's the standard English conjugation. I am, you are, he is, she is, it is, we are, and they are. Okay, so you probably know this is correct, right? I am, you are, he is, and so on. Okay, that is standard English. But I want to share with you that actually a lot of English speakers, native English speakers, conjugate to be differently. So have a look on the right, the descriptive verb conjugation. Here are some real examples of recorded speech of English regional dialects. So these were really recorded native English speakers from various areas in Britain. These sentences: I were going to, he were pulling the telephone wires, they was filling the trench. Notice the conjugation is different. Standard English, I am, but here we can see I were. Standard English, he is, but here we can see he were. And the final example, standard English, they are, but here you can see they was. So what's going on here? Well, the answer is that standard English has these standard conjugations with to be verb, but regional dialects don't always conjugate in the same way. So regional dialects have different versions of this. So in some areas of Britain, they say I were, or he were, or they was. Okay, so I want to share with you now a map here. And actually this map is through the British Library. I found this link through the British Library. And on this map, you can see all of these different points on the map of England. And these represent recordings. So these are recordings that were made by regional speakers throughout England. And you can see over here on this side different conjugations of I was and I were. Okay, so first person plural was, first person singular were, second person was, third person. So these are different marks on the map that have recordings of people that don't follow standard English with was and were. So if we go back to the slide now, these examples here were taken from that map, and that map shows you the recordings of these things. So this shows you that the standard English is not the same as how all native speakers speak. Okay, so the descriptive view takes into account these non-standard dialects. So I want to share with you my personal example of this. Now, I grew up in the middle of England, and you can see on the map the middle of England in the little box. And this area of England is actually known as the Black Country. It's in the Midlands, but this region is specifically known as the Black Country. And this is where I went to school and where I went to university. I actually grew up in a city called Wolverhampton, which you can see around about the middle of the Black Country. Now, it's called the Black Country because this is one of the areas where the Industrial Revolution started. And 100 years ago, 200 years ago, there was a lot of industrial activity here. There was a lot of factories, there were a lot of canals, and also some of the early kind of railway systems that were linking this area with the ports, such as Manchester and Liverpool, and the capital, London. So there was a lot of industrial activity here, and some of the first kind of factories and kind of industrial output. So it's known as the Black Country because of all the smoke, and a lot of coal was used, a lot of manufacturing, iron, and so on. So a long time ago, this area had a lot of smoke, a lot of soot, it was very dirty, and so on. So it's known as the Black Country. So there's a little bit of background. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, in the Black Country, the people of the Black Country have a nickname. They're called Yam Yams. So the people of Black Country are called Yam Yams. This is a reference to the use of Yawam instead of you are. Okay, so this is taken from Wikipedia. Now, we looked at before the examples of standard to be verb conjugation. And of course, the standard conjugation is you are. But in this area of the Black Country, in spoken language, people say yow am. Yow am. Okay? So when they're talking quickly, yam, yo am, it sounds like yam yam. Okay, so they have this nickname, yam yam, because when you listen to them talking, it sounds like yam yam yam. Okay? Okay, so in this area, they conjugate you are to you am, but also we am and they am. Okay, so in speaking, yow am, wim, them. Okay, so this is the non-standard dialect here. Okay, so here's an example. You've just learned that. So I found this example of a t-shirt online. What does this mean? Ow am ya? Okay, if you go to the Black Country, if you go to Wolverhampton, you'll hear people saying ow am ya. What does it mean? Okay, now that you've learned about this non-standard conjugation, you can probably guess what it means. Ow am ya, how am ya. So the am is are. Okay, so how am ya means how are you. In the Black Country, they say how am ya instead of how are you. Okay, because they're using the different form. Okay, so this is descriptive grammar, and to be honest, this kind of breaks all the rules that you've learned about grammar. When you learned about English in school, you probably learned that there are correct grammar rules, and we must follow these grammar rules. And there is some truth to that, but it's also worth knowing that the grammar rules that we've said are correct are not actually how everybody speaks. There are many different varieties of English. As we saw at the beginning, there's variety of spelling, there's variety of punctuation, and to be honest, there is variety of grammar. Okay, maybe you didn't expect it, but the standard English is not always the correct English, or in some areas they would consider other things to also be correct. Okay, now when I share this with people, I often get the question, well, what do they do in writing? Do they write it like this? Well, actually, no. When they're writing, they write the correct form of language. Okay, so they write the correct sentences. It's just in spoken language that they change according to the dialect. Okay. So there are regional dialects, but there is also a kind of standard written language. Okay, now maybe you know examples of this. For example, in Korea, the Jeju accent or the Jeju dialect is very different from the kind of standard Seoul dialect. Okay, so you might not be able to understand different dialects in your country, or they might have varieties. But that doesn't mean that they write in the same way, okay? And also an interesting thing about this is which is correct, okay? You learn a standard English, but there are varieties. So which one can we say is correct? Now, a prescriptive view of grammar would say that this is wrong. A descriptive view of grammar would accept that there are differences. Okay, so that's all about prescriptive and descriptive grammar. Okay, now a couple more things. If you're interested in learning more about the Black Country or hearing how those people speak, I want to recommend this TV show called Peaky Blinders. It's a really good TV show. It's kind of like gangster, set in the Industrial Revolution that I just mentioned. It's set in the Black Country, so you can see all of the things I talked about, factories, canals, and things like that. And it's about this family of gangsters at that time. Okay, so if you're interested in hearing the way that people in the Midlands speak, you can watch this show, and a lot of the characters in this show have this regional dialect from the Black Country. Okay, so just to finish off then, one more point about descriptive grammar. Descriptive grammar is also influenced by younger generations. So, as you know, younger people are often responsible, or they are the people who are kind of changing language and developing language and adding to language. So things like slang, for example, in Korea, things like Konglish. These things do change language. Language is not just a static, unchanging blob. Okay, language does change over time. And if you listen to how people spoke English 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, or even longer, you can see that language has changed over time. So even the prescriptive view of language has to accept that language changes. Okay? And it's interesting to see how things become accepted over time. At first, things are not accepted, but then as things become more and more common, they are accepted into the English dictionary. So the English dictionary is actually updated every year with new words, and often these words come from slang, the kind of slang that the young generations use. Okay, so have a think about that. How is the Korean language changing in younger generations? What are some examples of slang in your language? How do young people use language that's different from the kind of standard or prescriptive view of grammar and language. Okay, so language changes, and as teachers we should be aware of this, and it's useful to understand the difference between prescriptive grammar and descriptive grammar. Hope that was interesting and useful. Thank you very much.